You want to know the strangest thing about that morning? It was ordinary, painfully, boringly ordinary. That's the part nobody believes when I tell them. I was standing maybe 40 feet from the eastern gate of Aldermere Palace, the one they call the Lion Gate because of the two stone cats worn smooth by 300 years of rain. I'd come to Varennes on a whim. A cheap flight, a hostel bed, a guidebook I never opened. I was 26 and running from a breakup, if you want the honest version. Sometimes you fly to another country just to stand somewhere you've never stood and feel small in a new way. So there I was, small in a new way. The weather couldn't decide what it wanted. One minute the sun broke through and lit up the gold tips of the fence like someone had dipped them in honey. The next, a gray cloud rolled over and everything went flat and cold. There'd been rain overnight. You could smell it, that wet stone, wet leaf smell that clings to old cities in the morning. The cobbles still held little mirrors of water, and every so often a pigeon would strut through one and ruin the reflection. The crowd was the usual crowd. A school group in matching yellow caps, all of them bored out of their minds, half listening to a teacher who'd clearly given this same speech 100 times. A pair of honeymooners taking photos of each other taking photos. An old man on a bench with a paper bag of seeds, feeding birds like it was a full-time job. Tourists pressed up against the black iron fence with their phones out, waiting. Waiting for him, for the guard. There was just one on the outer post that morning, though I learned later there were more inside the courtyard I couldn't see. This one stood in the little sheltered box beside the gate. You know the type, the ceremonial uniform, deep green with silver braid in Varennes case, not the red you might expect. A tall black cap, white gloves, a ceremonial saber at his hip, the kind people assume is just for show. I remember thinking that exact thing, just for show. He couldn't have been much older than me. That surprised me. From a distance in the uniform they looked like statues, like something carved rather than born. But up close you could see he was young. Clean-shaven, a small nick on his jaw where he'd cut himself shaving that morning. That detail stuck with me for years afterward. He'd stood in a bathroom that morning, half asleep, and nicked his own jaw, same as anybody. His eyes were the thing, though. He looked at nothing and everything. Fixed forward past the crowd, past the street, at some point on the horizon only he could see. People waved, people made faces. One kid in the yellow caps did a whole dance right in front of him, the full arms out, wiggle everything routine, and the guard didn't so much as blink. The kid gave up after a while. They always give up. That's kind of the game, isn't it? See if you can crack the statue. And the statue always wins. I bought a coffee from a cart across the square and drifted back, cradling it in both hands for the warmth. It was that in-between hour, maybe 9:30. Too late for the early risers, too early for the lunch crowd. The square had a lazy, unfinished feeling to it. Somewhere a delivery van beeped as it reversed. A busker 2 streets over was murdering a song on an accordion. Nothing was wrong. I want to be really clear about that because of what comes next. There was no sign, no dark figure in the corner of my eye, no music swelling like in a film. The universe does not warn you. It just lets the ordinary morning keep being ordinary right up until the second it isn't. I noticed the man maybe 90 seconds before it happened, and even then I noticed him for the wrong reason. He was standing off to the side of the crowd near the end of the fence where the tourists thinned out. And what caught my eye wasn't menace. It was the coat. It was too warm for a coat like that, a heavy gray thing, buttoned all the way up, the collar turned high. Everyone else was in light jackets, some in t-shirts during the sunny stretches. And here was this man swaddled up like it was the dead of winter, sweating. I could see it even from where I stood, a sheen on his forehead. He kept wiping it with the back of his hand. Poor guy, I thought, probably not well. That's the honest truth of it. My first read on a man about to pull a knife was sympathy. I thought he was sick. I thought maybe he was one of those souls the city forgets about, the ones who drift through tourist squares because that's where the warmth and the crowds are. I almost went over to ask if he was all right. I've thought about that 1,000 times. What if I had? Would it have changed anything? Would he have looked at me and lost his nerve, or would I have just put myself in the path of it? You don't get to know. That's the cruelty of these things. You only ever get the version that happened. He kept looking at the guard. That's the other thing I clocked, a beat too late. Everybody looks at the guard, that's the whole point, that's why they're all there. But this was a different kind of looking. The tourists looked at the guard the way you look at a monument. This man looked at him the way you look at a door you're trying to decide whether to walk through. Calculating. His jaw kept working, like he was chewing on something or talking to himself under his breath. I slowed down. I didn't know why yet. The body knows before the mind does. I've since read that somewhere, and it's true, there's a part of you, some old animal part, that starts pumping the brakes before you've consciously understood a single thing. My feet just stopped. My coffee had gone lukewarm in my hands and I'd stopped drinking it. I was watching the man in the coat, and some cold thread was pulling itself tight in my stomach. Then he moved. It wasn't a lunge, not at first. That's what people get wrong when they imagine it. He didn't come screaming out of the crowd. He walked. Fast, but a walk straight toward the gate, straight toward the young guard in the green uniform, and his right hand was going into the coat as he moved. And the crowd was still just standing there, phones up. Not one of them understanding yet what I was only barely beginning to understand myself. I opened my mouth. I think I meant to shout, but nothing came out. Have you ever had that? A dream where you scream and there's no sound. It was like that. My whole body had gone to static. And the guard's eyes moved. Just his eyes. First. That's the thing I'll never forget as long as I live. Everything about him had been frozen for the better part of an hour, this perfect ornamental stillness. And in the space of a heartbeat, his eyes came off the horizon and landed on the man in the coat like two hands catching a falling glass. He'd seen it. Before any of us, before the man had even fully cleared his hand from the coat. The guard had seen it. The man's hand came out. And there was the knife. I want to describe it right because in my memory it's enormous, this gleaming terrible thing, but I know that's the fear talking. It was a kitchen knife, honestly. That's what the report said later. A long kitchen knife with a black handle, the kind you'd have in any drawer in any house. Somehow that was worse. Not some exotic weapon. A thing from a kitchen. A thing meant for bread and vegetables turned into this. Sunlight chose that exact moment to break through the clouds. I remember the blade catching it, a hard white flash. Somebody screamed. Not me, I still had no voice. A woman near the front, one of the honeymooners maybe. And then the whole crowd's understanding arrived at once, this collective full-body flinch, everyone recoiling backward like a single organism, phones tumbling, the school kids shrieking, the old man's paper bag of seeds spilling across the cobbles as he half rose off the bench. The man was maybe 6 feet from the guard now, knife up, coat flapping. His face, I could see his face, and it was wet with sweat and twisted up with something I still don't have a word for. Not rage exactly, something more lost than rage. And here is where time did the thing it does, where it splits, where a second and a half stretches out into this vast, slow unspooling that you could narrate for an hour and still not capture. Because the guard was already moving. Not away, toward. Everyone always assumes they'd run. I did too before that day. You picture yourself brave, but honestly, when you imagine a knife, some deep sensible part of you plans the exit. The guard didn't have an exit in him. Or if he did, he'd trained it out, drilled it out, stood it out of himself in 1,000 cold mornings on that post until the running was gone and only the standing was left. He stepped off his post and into the man. I'll try to give it to you the way it happened, though my eyes could barely keep up. The man drove the knife forward, a straight thrust, aimed at the guard's middle, and the guard didn't lean back from it. He turned. This sharp quarter turn of his whole body sideways, so the blade went past instead of in. I actually saw the fabric of his uniform move where it grazed him. That's how close. And in the same motion, the same single unbroken motion, his left hand came down like a bar dropping across a door and clamped onto the man's wrist. The wrist with the knife. He didn't grab for the knife. That's the thing the trained people all pointed out afterward when the video went everywhere. Amateurs go for the blade. He went for the wrist, controlled the wrist, and the knife became just a thing attached to a wrist he now owned. The man was bigger than him, I should say that, heavier, thick through the shoulders under that stupid coat, and for a second, one horrible second, the two of them were locked together and it could have gone any way at all. The man wrenched, tried to tear his arm free, threw his weight into the guard to bowl him over. And the guard gave ground half a step, a stumble, and my heart just stopped dead in my chest because I thought, he's going down, he's going to go down, and the man is going to be on top of him with that knife. He didn't go down. He rode the stumble, turned it into a pivot, used the man's own forward weight against him, the way you'd use a slamming door, and suddenly the man was off balance, lurching past, and the guard was behind his arm now, twisting it, driving it up and back at an angle wrists were never built to go. The knife hit the cobbles. I heard it. Over all the screaming, somehow, I heard that little metal clatter, the most ordinary sound in the world, a knife dropping on stone. And I swear that sound is what broke the spell on me, because that's the moment my voice came back and I heard myself shouting, nothing words, just noise, just the sound a person makes. The man went down face first onto the wet cobbles with the guard's knee in his back and his arm wrenched up behind him, and it had taken, what, 3 seconds, 4. Later, when I watched the footage, I timed it, 4 seconds. From the knife coming out to the man on the ground, 4 seconds. It had felt like a war. Here's a thing nobody tells you about a moment like that. When it ends, it doesn't feel like it ended. Your body doesn't get the message. The knife was on the ground and the man was face down on the cobbles, but I was still standing there rigid as a fence post, my lukewarm coffee somehow still in my hand, every muscle braced for a thing that had already happened. The square had gone strange. Not silent, the opposite. There was this rising wall of noise, screaming and shouting all tangled up together, but underneath it was a kind of hole where the ordinary morning used to be. The accordion 2 streets over had stopped. Even the busker had felt something reach him. The guard hadn't said a word. That's what struck me. In the films there's always a shout, some barked command, but this young man in the green uniform just did what he did in total silence, jaw set, breathing hard through his nose. He had the man pinned with a knee in the small of his back and that arm cranked up behind, and the man was thrashing underneath him, and still the guard said nothing. He just held the way a rock holds. Whatever it cost him, it didn't show on his face. Then the doors came open. I mean the big ones, the courtyard doors inside the lion gate, the ones I'd assumed were purely decorative. They banged open and 3 more guards came through at a dead sprint, and behind them 2 men in dark suits with earpieces, moving even faster. The whole square seemed to tilt toward them. The ceremonial slowness of the place, the whole 300-year performance of stillness, had cracked open, and what was underneath was fast and hard and absolutely real. They flooded around the young guard and his prisoner. One of them kicked the knife further away, sent it skittering across the wet stone toward the fence, and a tourist actually jumped back from it like it was a live thing. 2 of them took over the man on the ground, and only then, only when the weight of other hands had replaced his, did the young guard let go and stand up. And he swayed. Just slightly. Half a step to catch his balance. I don't think 1 person in 100 would have noticed it, but I was locked onto him. I couldn't have looked away if the sky had fallen, and I saw it. The stillness had a price, and it was coming due now, in the shake of his hands as he straightened his uniform, in the way his chest was heaving. He'd been a statue for an hour and a weapon for 4 seconds, and now he was just a tired young man standing in a square full of screaming strangers. One of the suited men said something to him. The guard nodded, said something back, I couldn't hear it. Then he did the thing I still can't fully explain. He went back to his post. I swear to you, the man who tried to kill him was being hauled up off the cobbles 10 feet away, wrists bound behind him now, and this young guard walked the 3 steps back to his little sheltered box beside the gate, turned smartly on his heel and resumed his position. Chin up, eyes forward, hands at his sides, as if nothing had happened, as if the last 2 minutes had been a thing he'd dreamed. His hands were still shaking. You could see it if you knew to look. But he stood there, and he fixed his eyes back on that same invisible point on the horizon, and he stood. I didn't understand it then. I think I do now. It wasn't for show. It wasn't stubbornness. It was the only thing he had left that was solid. The world had come apart for 4 seconds, and the post, the standing, the stillness, the discipline older than him, was the thing that let him put it back together. He didn't go back to the post because the rules said so. He went back because it was the only floor left to stand on. They cleared the square after that. It happened fast and it happened calm, which surprised me. More people came, uniformed police now, a couple of them and then more, sealing off the ends of the square with that unhurried authority that somehow makes a crowd obey without anyone raising their voice. We were all funneled back toward the fountain at the square's far end, and I went with the herd because that's what you do, because your legs make decisions your brain isn't up to yet. The man in the coat was gone within minutes, bundled into the back of a vehicle, that gray coat and all. I got one last look at his face as they turned him, and I'll be honest, it wasn't the face of a monster. That was the hardest part to sit with later. It was just a face. Wet, exhausted, lost. Whatever storm had driven him to that square with a kitchen knife, it had blown itself out, and what was left looked almost relieved. Like a man who'd been carrying something too heavy for too long, and had finally, terribly, set it down. I never found out the whole of his story. Bits came out in the days after that he'd been unwell, that there'd been warning signs nobody had acted on, that he'd targeted the guard not out of any grand cause but out of some private darkness that had chosen that gate, that morning, that young man in green, for reasons that maybe even he couldn't have told you. I've made my peace with not knowing. Some things don't come with an explanation attached. They just come. The honeymooners were near me by the fountain, and the woman was crying, the one who'd screamed. Her husband had his arm around her, and he kept saying, "It's over, it's over, it's over," the way you do when you're really saying it to yourself. The school kids in the yellow caps had gone completely silent, all their earlier boredom scrubbed clean off their faces, herded into a tight knot by teachers who looked about as steady as I felt. The old man from the bench was there too. Somebody had helped him. His paper bag was gone, but a few seeds still clung to his cardigan, and he brushed at them, over and over, this small, useless, repetitive motion, and I understood it completely. You need something to do with your hands. You need one small, ordinary task to prove the ordinary world still exists. I looked back at the gate. The guard was still there. Of course he was. Small and green and straight-backed in the distance, framed by the two worn stone lions, standing his post like the whole thing had been somebody else's morning. And around him the machinery of aftermath churned, police, radios, the yellow tape going up, the knife being photographed where it lay, and in the dead center of all of it stood this one still point. This one young man who decided that the answer to chaos was to become, again, a fixed thing the chaos could break itself against. I found out later they'd tried to relieve him. Standard procedure, apparently. An officer involved in something like that, you pull them, you check them over, you sit them down. A senior man had come out and offered to have him stood down, and the young guard had asked to finish his watch. I heard that secondhand, weeks after, from someone who'd know, and I had to sit down when I heard it, because I'd seen his hands shaking. I'd seen the sway when he stood up. He was not fine. No one could have been fine. And still he'd asked to stay on that cold stone until his relief came at the proper hour, because the post was his and the day wasn't done, and some code deeper than fear had a hold of him that I don't think most of us will ever fully understand. I want to tell you about the phones, because this is the part that turns my stomach a little even now. As the square emptied, as the shock started to loosen its grip, I watched dozens of people do the same thing at almost the same time. They lifted their phones, not to call anyone, to check the footage, to see if they'd got it. And a lot of them had. The whole thing had happened in front of maybe 100 raised cameras, because that's what a royal gate is now, 100 cameras pointed at a man whose job is to stand still. They'd all been filming the statue, hopping for a twitch, a smile, a viral nothing, and instead they'd caught 4 seconds that would go around the world by nightfall. By that evening it was everywhere. You've probably seen it or a version of it. The turn, the wrist, the man going down, the knife on the stone. It got carved up into clips, slowed down, drawn over with arrows by people explaining the technique. Experts appeared from nowhere. The young guard became, for about a week, the most famous anonymous man alive, because they never released his name, and I was glad of that, fiercely glad, because a name would have turned him into a celebrity, and what he'd done deserved better than to become content. But I was there, and I'll tell you what the footage doesn't have. The footage doesn't have the shaving nick on his jaw. It doesn't have the sway. It doesn't have the specific quality of the silence in that square in the half-second before it broke. It doesn't have the man's face at the end, that terrible relief. It doesn't have the old man brushing seeds off his cardigan, over and over. The footage caught the 4 seconds and missed the whole rest of it, the human weather of that morning, the way it settled on all of us and never quite lifted. I stood by that fountain for a long time, long after they let us go. The sun kept doing its indecisive thing, in and out of the clouds, painting the gold fence tips and then dropping them back into gray. And I watched the young guard stand his watch, and I thought about how close I'd come to walking over to the man in the coat to ask if he was all right, and I thought about the 4 seconds, and I thought about a thing I couldn't yet put into words. I'll get to those words in the last part. Because there's more. There's what happened when his relief finally came, and there's the thing I saw that almost nobody else stayed long enough to see, the small human moment at the very end that changed how I think about courage entirely. Most people left. I want you to understand that, because it matters for what I'm about to tell you. Once the police opened the square back up, once the tape came down and the vehicles pulled away and the story had been safely captured on 100 phones, the crowd just drained off, back to their hotels, their tour buses, their ordinary days that had been so briefly and so violently interrupted. Within an hour the square looked almost normal again. A cleaner came and hosed the cobbles where the man had gone down. The pigeons came back for the old man's spilled seeds. I couldn't leave. I don't fully know why. I had nowhere to be, that was the whole point of the trip. Nowhere to be, no one waiting. But it was more than that. I felt like leaving would have been a kind of betrayal. Like the young guard had done this enormous thing and then simply gone back to standing. And if everyone just walked away and posted their clips, then nobody would have witnessed it. Really witnessed it. The seeing all the way through to the end. So I stayed. I bought another coffee, the first one I'd dropped somewhere in the chaos. I never even noticed when. And I sat on the old man's bench, which was empty now, and I watched him stand his post. And here's the strange, quiet, beautiful thing about the hours that followed. Nothing happened. Nothing at all. Stood. The clouds moved. A new crowd slowly gathered, a fresh set of tourists with no idea what had happened here that morning, and they did all the usual things, the waving, the faces, the trying to make the statue crack. A little girl blew him a kiss. A man in a football shirt tried to make him laugh with a rude gesture and got nothing for his trouble. The ordinary performance resumed, the ancient game of tourist versus guard, as if the square had a short memory and had already forgiven the morning. But I knew. I sat there and I knew what none of them knew, and it changed how I saw every second of it. Every moment he stood there now was a moment he was choosing again, after everything. The stillness that had looked so effortless at 9 that morning looked to me now like the hardest thing a person could do, because I'd seen underneath it. I'd seen the shaking hands and the sway. And he'd folded all of that back down inside himself and become the statue again. And he was holding it there by pure will, hour after hour, in front of people who thought he was just decoration. I thought about my breakup, if you can believe it, sitting on that bench. The thing I'd flown across a continent to run away from that had felt so enormous and so consuming. And it just shrank. Not because it stopped mattering, but because I was looking at something that put the whole scale of things in a different light. Here was a young man who'd chosen to stand between a knife and a crowd of strangers, and here was me, who'd flown to another country to feel small. Well, I was feeling small now. But it was a different smallness than the one I came for. It wasn't the smallness of being unloved. It was the smallness of standing next to something genuinely large. His relief came in the late afternoon. The light had gone golden and long by then, the way it does when a day is thinking about ending. I'd almost stopped expecting anything. And then there was movement at the lion gate, and a second guard came out, the changing of the watch, done properly, ceremonially, all crisp turns and stamped heels, exactly the way it's done every single day whether or not a man has tried to kill somebody that morning. That was its own kind of statement, I realized. The ceremony didn't bend. The ceremony went on. That was the whole point of it. That was what it was for. The two of them went through the ritual, the handover, and then the young guard, my guard. I'd started thinking of him, though I had no right to, turned and marched back through the gate. Off the post at last. Watch complete. And most people, if they'd stayed at all, would have counted that as the end. The clip ends when the man goes down. The story ends when the shift ends. But I was watching, and because I was watching, I saw the thing almost nobody saw. Just inside the gate, in the shadow of the archway where he must have thought he was out of sight, the young guard stopped. And for just a moment, 3 seconds maybe, the same length as the thing itself, he wasn't a statue anymore. His shoulders came down. His head dropped forward. One white-gloved hand came up and pressed flat against the old stone of the arch, and he just leaned there, holding himself up against 300 years of wall, and let it all move through him. Whatever it was. The fear he hadn't been allowed to feel at 9 that morning, catching up with him at last now that the watch was done, and the post was another man's. I couldn't see his face. I'm glad I couldn't. Some things aren't ours to look at, but I saw his back and the set of his shoulders and the way that one hand pressed against the stone, and I understood something that I have carried with me every day since. Courage isn't the not being afraid. I used to think it was. I think most people think it is. We watch the 4-second clip and we imagine the guard felt nothing, some machine calm, and that's why he could do what he did. But that's exactly wrong. He felt all of it. Every bit of the terror any of us would have felt. The nick on his jaw, the shaking hands, the sway when he stood, the leaning against the wall when he thought no one could see, that was a frightened human being, same as me, same as you. The courage wasn't the absence of the fear. The courage was that he did the thing anyway, and then stood his post anyway, and only let the fear have him afterward in the shadows on his own time, against a wall. Then he straightened up, squared his shoulders, and walked on into the courtyard out of my sight, and I never saw him again. I flew home a few days later. The trip had done its work, though not in the way I'd planned. I'd come to feel small, and I'd left feeling small in the right direction, if that makes any sense. Pointed outward instead of inward. The clip is still out there. Every so often it resurfaces and I see it again. The turn and the wrist and the knife on the stone, and the comments are always the same. How did he stay so calm? What a machine, nerves of steel. And I never comment. What would I even say? I was there. It wasn't steel. It was worse than steel and better than steel. It was a scared young man who decided the fear didn't get a vote until his watch was over. I think about him at odd times, when I have to do something I'm frightened of. A hard conversation, a doctor's appointment. A thing I want to run from. I think about the nick on his jaw and the hand against the stone. And I tell myself the thing his back taught me in the shadow of that arch. You don't have to not be afraid. You just have to stand your post. And when it's done, only when it's done, you can lean against the wall and let yourself shake. He never knew I watched him do that. He never knew anyone did. That's the part that gets me still. The bravest thing I ever saw a person do, he did believing no one was looking. Maybe that's the only kind that really counts.